Okay, so welcome back everyone to our second panel of the day. We will be talking about liminal spaces, and our first speaker is Ayushman Bhagat from our TraffLab project here at Tel Aviv University, and his paper is Bilateral Labor Agreements Ban on Domestic Work in Nepal. Please, Ayushman.
Thank you so much, Tama. But there is a technical error, I guess. I'm not able to share my screen. It says host.
Hold on, let me try to fix that.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, you should now be able to do that.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much. Majority of the discussions around bilateral labor agreement is why countries sign bilateral labor agreements, whether it works or not, what are the roles, and how possibly we can improve on the situation. But in this presentation, I'm not going to talk about any of this. What I'm going to talk about is why countries use bilateral labor agreements, to be specific, why the absence of bilateral labor agreements is used as a justification of domestic work ban in Nepal. Now, how different actors and institutions, especially in source countries like Nepal, appropriate this particular policy, and what are its spatial consequences? To begin with, the problem of exploitation of migrant domestic workers is very, very old in Nepal. Now, many researchers have found so many issues that migrant domestic workers face, especially in Gulf countries. And as a result of that, majority of the times, migrant domestic workers ask embassy for help, if at all there is an embassy, in those countries. If there is no embassy, they go to recruitment agencies, and if there is no recruitment agency, they actually leave and join illegal diasporic community in all those places. Now, this creates quite a lot of issues, both in the source country and the hosting countries. Now, in source countries, civil society organizations, anti-trafficking NGOs, migration-based NGOs, they interrogate Nepal a lot. They say that what exactly are you doing to assure welfare and rights of migrant workers? Now, Nepal doesn't have any solution to that because we all know the nature of domestic workers and what kind of precarity that they face. Now, the one thing that Nepal does is it imposes bans on mobility of migrant domestic workers, and the history of ban is very, very. So before 1988, people used to take, it should be 1998, people used to take permission from a male member of the society, especially women used to take permission from the male members of society to move. And over the period of time, something happened. I mean, maybe there was this case of suicide or murder. We really don't know anything about it in Tibet, I guess. That actually forced the government to impose ban. And as you can see that, over the period of 10, 15, 16 years, Nepal government has imposed more than 12, 13 bans. Now in 2017, immediately after the Gorkha earthquake that happened in 2015, majority of the women started migrating to Middle East. In 17, Nepal imposed a bracket umbrella ban on mobility of domestic workers. And this for the first time, it says that unless there is a special and exclusive bilateral agreement with the hosting country, we are not allowing any domestic workers to leave the country. Now, this is something which is very important because BLA is being valorized in Nepal due to several reasons. Now, these are the several points that Nepal brings on table whenever it discusses BLA. As you can see, employers' space principle, and this is actually one of the most interesting thing that Nepal boasts about all over the world. They say that employees should not pay anything. Visa cost, insurance cost, agency fees, flight charges, return costs should be there by employers. How much it is successful, we really don't know. Of course, employers, they talk about employers' mobility, they talk about non-confiscation of documents, and these all amazing things, which assures decent working conditions across the different sectors of labor. So what happens is, because of this, the potential of the BLAs is so high, it actually valorizes, it actually justifies the migration bans. It says that if there is a BLA, there is the workers' condition would be much better. So the assumption here is we can really solve literally all issues of domestic work through BLA. But the problem is no country wants to get into an exclusive BLA with domestic. Several Middle Eastern countries, they have like signed BLA with Nepal on different labors, but they really do different labor sector, but they really do not want to get into BLA with Nepal. Now, on the other hand, Nepal also doesn't allow its citizens to leave, because as you can see, the last ban happened in 2017. And after that, Nepal is very, very silent, not opening up. And it's quite clear that unless there is a BLA, you are really not going to go. But only one Middle Eastern country has signed BLA with on domestic work with Nepal, and that is, we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the question here is not why countries sign BLA. The question here would be why countries do not sign BLA on domestic work. Maybe it's lack of political will. Maybe, I mean, Nepal doesn't know, the power asymmetry that Hila was mentioning. Maybe Nepal is not able to negotiate properly, or maybe the demands of, like the BLA is the thing that Nepal talks about, boast about is quite like, high, and it's very hard for this hosting country to meet all these demands. And in order to meet demand, I mean, it has to make appropriate systems, for example, labor inspection. It has to do abolition of systems like kafala and all. So it's very, very difficult for the hosting country as well. However, it doesn't mean that people do not migrate. Even if this is there, even if there is a ban, the traffic of to work in domestic sector in Middle East is very, very high among Nepalese women. Nepalese women anyway migrate through a variety of irregular channels for international domestic. But as you can see in the quote, it's quite clearly mentioned that there is no point in staying here in the community, because if you have to listen to the abuses, at least you can earn money out of it if you go to Middle Eastern countries. So these are the arguments that is being made by women, whom I've interviewed. But the point is, this actually creates quite a lot of other discourses, have actually created spaces for quite a lot of other discourses, and it creates entrapment. So as you can see, that one of the consequences of migration ban is spatial entrapment. The ban clearly encloses thousands of potential domestic workers inside the country. Clearly, the state is not providing these women a sustainable employment opportunity, so they have to work. They have to entrap. They basically, policy entraps these. However, people do exercise their rights. Sometimes they do not do anything, but sometimes they subvert and escape these kind of variety of things. And the place where I did my research in, a post-disaster or trafficking-prone region, majority of them, like every woman from every single household, one woman was in Middle East. Now, this is something which is very interesting, because when there is this conflict between the control and the conflict between the agency, people's mobility and all. So when these two things conflict, then it actually creates space for a variety of different actors and institutions. Now, one of the most prominent actors here are anti-trafficking NGOs and migration NGOs. They justify their activities through the absence of BLA. It says that unless there is a BLA, we will not allow anyone to move through irregular channels. And as a result, they do quite a lot of different kind of activities. One of the activities is safe migration program. I believe that this is anti-migration program. They go to the community and say that don't go, otherwise you will get trafficked. Because unless there is this, BLA between like source and hosting countries, you should not go. Also, some of the anti-trafficking organizations, they do border surveillance, and they use exactly the same logic that we cannot allow these women to go, because if they will go, they will get trafficked. So this is like infringement of basically human rights, which the absence of BLA on domestic work facilitates. Now, these interventions, these continuous conflict between mobility and control, it affects like emotionally and psychologically as well. The people are fearful that you really don't know when and how you will be trapped. And this is something which is very interesting, because that's one of the reasons why people do not disclose literally anything to any of these agencies. And there are so many organizations in Nepal which says that they really don't say anything to us, and if we enter into their community, chances are very high that they will beat us. So these are the narratives which are there around. So first is like a spatial entrapment, and second one is exclusion. Now this is something which is very interesting as well, because the only country that Nepal has signed BLA on domestic work is Jordan. But the traffic of domestic work is very, very high. Like tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of women want to go, but the intake is like very, very less. For example, on the first round, the government of Nepal issued only 500 labor permits to different placement agencies to, to facilitate the mobility of domestic work. But this, of course, creates a dichotomy of like worthy and unworthy migrant, and this creates a very, very different discussions. Now, the women who might like transgress, these migration ban, they are not recognized in Nepal. They are recognized as like missing workers. The moment you place a label of missing worker, missing people, you will not be able to give labor rights to any of these people. So just imagine if somebody leaves Nepal through irregular channel and, working in like, let's say Kuwait, and the person like faces quite a lot of exploitation and the person leaves the labor relation, all of a sudden the person will become an illegal immigrant and Nepal will not come to rescue it. And one thing that was highly debated in the policy circles of Nepal is during COVID-19, the government issued a priority list to bring back all the stranded Nepalese migrant workers, but there was no mention of, these like, how you will be how you will rehabilitate all those people who like migrate illegally, because these people do not exist in the migration registers of Nepal. This creates quite a lot of like problems, and it excludes a significant amount of women workers from the legal protection of Nepal. Now,
Ayushman, if you could start wrapping up.
Yes. I mean, I think this is the last slide. Yes. So, I mean, the consequences of the absence of BLA on domestic work in the spaces of entrapment exclusions are something which is also worthwhile noticing. The first is like Nepal is imposing reproductive and productive duties on Nepalese women. If you can see on the bans, there once upon a time there was this ban which says that no women are allowed to leave unless their child is like more than 2 years old. So it clearly says that you have to fulfill your reproductive duty before you like leave your particular borders, Nepal border. And then second is, of course, because of the entrapment that is being produced, and there are so many actors and institutions which actually facilitates that particular entrapment. These women who migrate through irregular channels, they face a variety of borders, in like household, highways, Indo-Nepal political border, the immigration detention centers and all. And of course, it affects their psychological and emotional register. And then this is, and it says, especially when I was talking to this trade union in Nepal, which is doing some interesting work in like Middle East, it says that just because of the fact that there is this migration ban, and government of Nepal is very, very adamant that it is not going to open up migration bans on domestic work unless there is a BLA, it has changed the recruitment patterns as well. So what is happening is there are so many organizations which are recruiting women through regular channel and putting them in domestic work and all that. So clearly it facilitates some sort of, I don't want to call it as trafficking, but definitely there is a probability of being deceived in this particular case. Now, to wrap up, I think, do BLAs on domestic work matters much on ground? We really don't know. The case is like the only country that Nepal has signed BLA is on domestic work is Jordan. While the government assumes that working conditions has been improved, there are so many activist accounts in Jordan which suggest that conditions are, it has improved a little bit, but it has not been improved significantly. There's no enforcement in household, and like labor inspections are not there, and abusive working conditions. And some of the people do face, the majority of the domestic workers, I would say, do face the long working hours. So if the BLA on domestic work, it doesn't matter on ground, then the question is why Nepalese citizens should bear the cost of assumptions of BLA on domestic work. And the cost that I explained was cases of entrapment and space.
Okay, thank you so much. So the respondent is Rebeca Raijman from the University of Haifa.
Of course.
Rebecca, are you with us? I can't.
Yes,
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I asked you to make me a co-host.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
You did? Okay. 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 So, okay. So, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to read this paper and learn about labor migration from Nepal. So we have here the perspective of the sending country. So I think that this paper makes a contribution to the literature by adopting a gender perspective for the analysis of labor migration governance from the perspective of the sending country. It is grounded on feminist legal geography approach, and the article examines how both the presence and the absence of bilateral agreements in domestic work produces spaces of entrapment and exclusion for the potential migrant female domestic workers from Nepal. So how does the presence and absence of BLAs produce entrapment and inclusion for migrant women? First of all, there is a limited intake of domestic workers under existing BLAs. Migration bans, as were presented by the author. And these migration bans are interestingly not on men who also suffer from exploitation and high mortality rates, okay? So these bans push women into irregular forms of migration. So they have to pay fees to cross the border via India, and they sometimes are victims of trafficking. And as was already said, the government of Nepal does not recognize women who emigrated through irregular channels or those who became undocumented during their stay in their countries of destination. So they are excluded from the protection of the state. So there is the creation of two categories, the unworthy, undeserving migrants, the irregular migrants, vis-a-vis the worthy, deserving migrants. So what we witness is the emergence of a pool of precarious female labor for domestic jobs that are sending remittances back home without any obligations on the sending nation to protect their rights. The focus of the paper and its main contribution is on the consequences of presence and absence of bilateral agreements for the intimate lives of migrant women, showing how enforcement of reproductive duties on women shapes conditions for intimate violence at multiple sites and increases their existing vulnerability towards exploitation. Okay, so I want to focus on the strengths of the paper. The feminist legal geography approach highlights how the law and regulations, for example, in this case, migration bans, based on gender, age, and family situation, justified by the need to protect migrant women in the domestic sector, and I quote, reproduce power dynamics and inequities that govern and structure the lives of migrant women, and normalizes historical domination of women in a variety of ways. So the use of this theoretical lens makes visible different forms of violence inherent in the implementation of the law and how it shapes everyday life more generally. And this feminist legal geography approach resembles in some way the approach of the sociologist Cecilia Menjivar that work on the integration of migrants from Central America in the US, and she also suggests the use of the concept of legal violence. So legal violence captures the suffering that results and is made possible through the implementation of the body of laws that delineate and shapes individuals' lives on a routine basis. Okay, so in this case, while protectionist immigration policies like bans purport to have the positive objective of protecting rights or controlling behavior for the general good, simultaneously give rise to practices that harm a particular social group, in this case, women looking for a job as a domestic worker outside of Nepal. The other contribution of the paper is the use of the concept of detention and internal deportation. That detention and deportation are concepts used from an immigration regime perspective, so from the country of destination perspective. In the paper, we learned that while migrating via irregular channels, women are being trapped by anti-trafficking NGOs of Nepal. And if a woman is found suspicious while trying to cross the border, then she is detained and deported back to the village. And the fear of being detained and deported by the anti-trafficking NGOs produces stigma in the community and the household spaces. Okay, as I said, usually the literature deals with issues of detention, deportation in countries of destination. And in the paper, by focusing on the country of origin and suggesting the concepts of internal detention and internal deportation, the paper extends the Genova understanding of the deportation regime from immigrations regime to emigrations regimes. I have some comments and questions that I would like to raise now. The role of non-state actors, such as anti-trafficking NGOs in the enforcement of the restrictive policies. I wanted to ask, who are these NGOs? Are they funded by the state? Do they have the power to detain people? Although not the focus of the paper, it will help the reader not acquainted with Nepal to understand this type of NGOs' policing practices. The other issue that you pointed out in the article is about irregular migrants that do not benefit from the protection of the state. So could you please elaborate on what consists this hypothetical type of protection? For example, without having a work permit, migrants cannot pay for the Foreign Employment Promotion Board collective insurance. If workers have accidents, death, or need to be rescued, as it happened during the COVID crisis, the government uses this fund. But without the work permit, female migrants are excluded from this scheme. I think that citing this this type of protection or expanding of the type of protections neglected to irregular migrants could be very helpful to in the paper. Other comments have to do with the research design, which is a participatory action research, and it's very interesting. And I think that you should further explain in the paper about this specific design. So what is a participatory design research design, and what are the strengths of such a design, mostly in the case of your study? Other aspects that I think could be included is Nepal vis-a-vis other sending countries in Asia, okay? So how are these issues of bans handled in other countries? For example, if they are such in, I know that they are in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, etc. Okay, I have another comment that I would like to bring here is when you are talking of entrapment and exclusion, I think that it would be interesting if you could give a definition of these concepts and also explain what are the dimensions or the sides or the intimate lives of women that you are focusing on to highlight the entrapment and exclusion. Okay. Besides that, I find the paper very interesting, and I think that it's a great contribution also to the workshop, because it's not focusing on the effects of bilateral agreements on workers' rights or recruitment practices, but on the personal lives of the women involved in the act of migration. Thank you for the paper.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Ayushman, maybe you can comment or respond briefly, and we already have two questions. One I have in the chat, and we have a hand up, and anyone else interested in commenting, please raise your hand.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for such an insightful comments and reading of the paper. First of all, I mean, I would like to say that your questions are really, really important, and it actually is like forcing me to think through further about this particular paper that I'm trying to write. I mean, I'd like to briefly cover some of the questions that you raised in your commentary. That I mean, the NGOs that you are talking about, these are basically anti-trafficking NGOs, and there are basically two types of anti-trafficking NGOs. I mean, of course, there are several types of anti-trafficking NGOs, but basically there are two. One is like feeding into like abolitionist approach. It says that you are not supposed to go for like sex work, domestic work, everything is bad. If you go, you will get trafficked, blah, 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 blah. And these people have their like small choke points, this is what I call, and along the migration routes, along the national highways, along Indo-Nepal borders. Now, the government of Nepal allows these NGOs to have only 2 checkposts like that in every border, right? That's basically to protect people from sex work, basically. These people, the original idea was not to allow women to go to sex work, right? But over the period of time when anti-trafficking like fused with domestic work, these people started to do, like scaled up their jobs. Now, this is hardcore approach that some anti-trafficking NGOs do, but there are other anti-trafficking NGOs which talks about safe migration and all those sort of stuff. And these are funded by organizations like ILO and all. So they go to like grassroots level, and they talk about, what are the dangers of migrating, through irregular channels and all. So of course, funding comes from like variety of sources. It's very, very like ideological space in Nepal. And so many organizations from all over the world, they fund these organizations. Of course, like evangelical organization would fund hardcore, anti-trafficking organizations, and other organizations like ILO would fund for like, softcore approach like migration, safe migration training and all. Now, of course, I mean, research, the design, I mean, it's something which is very, very interesting. And I mean, it requires I will definitely elaborate on it. Participatory action research is something which is very, very exciting. And I think I should talk a little bit more about it. But the whole idea was not to, do research on one particular thing. I just wanted to understand how people move and what are the challenges that they face. And, these two questions led to the evolution, I would say, from grassroots of participatory approach. And over the period of time, people took ownership of the entire project, which was kind of exciting in its own realm. But I will definitely talk a little bit more about that in my paper. And of course, entrapment and exclusion, I mean, I could clearly see why it's important to put definitions, and I will definitely take this comment on board, because I mean, entrapment sounds like a very static concept, but I mean, it's not like people are nailed to the ground, but it's a process, it's a very, very like processual stuff that's happening over there. And the sites, and it clearly relates to the sites. Of course, when I'll define it, I will also define, the diffused sites where, people do face entrapment. They're like household, airports, checkposts, choke points, national highways and all. So thank you so much for the comments. I'll definitely take it.
Okay, thank you, Ayushman. So I'll start with a question I have in the chat from Helen Schwenken. So she says, thanks for the wonderful presentation, Ayushman. She was wondering whether you could say something about the differences that were made in public and policy on protecting men and women, as most bans only target women. What do you think about the gender aspect?
So this is something which is very, very exciting because Nepal has already always been criticized from the day one. The migration ban was very, very gendered, like before 1998, women were supposed to take permission from the male member, and then over the period of time, it keep on changing. But in 2017, Nepal government imposed this bracket umbrella ban on domestic work. For the first time, it moved from, gender to work. It says that nobody is going to go for domestic work, but clearly we know that, it affects women the most. So clearly, I mean, the thing is exactly the same on the ground, but it's in a very coveted form. It is targeting a specific gender and all. And of course, I mean, this gets very nuanced, the discussion, because majority of the women who suffer from this particular kind of policy is very classed, raised. I mean, clearly. So basically, I do research with Tamang women. Tamang women are indigenous tribe. And these are the targets of anti-trafficking NGOs. These are the targets of ban because these are the women who migrate, because they live in Himalayan mountains and all, and they don't have much livelihood, so they move. So this is one aspect of that. But as far as male is concerned, clearly it doesn't give a shit about it. I mean, if I be very, very blunt, because I mean, I have interviewed quite a lot of male migrants who go to those countries where countries have signed BLAs, and literally each and every clause of BLAs are being nullified by their experiences. Their exploitation starts from the moment they leave the country, the moment they leave their village. They go to Kathmandu, so many things happen. They went to Middle East or maybe Malaysia. They know that they are working in a very, very different kind of employment, and these countries are being covered under the BLAs. So clearly the focus is a lot towards one specific gender, and that is actually allowing the government not to take care of other side of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Piasiri Wikramaskara, please.
Okay, actually, my first observation regarding the paper is that this condition of BLS is common in Asian countries. For instance, Philippines had for a long time the condition that a country should have a BLA with the Philippines if workers are to migrate. Similarly, with Ethiopia, Overseas Proclamation of 2017, it's a condition for people to migrate. The second point, a clarification, I'm not sure that Nepal signed a separate domestic worker agreement with Jordan, because the latest agreement we have, 2017 General Agreement, actually it covers both general workers as well as domestic workers. There are two separate standard employment contracts attached to the agreement. So therefore, I want to clarify whether this is indeed the case. The point I also want to know why there was no agreement with Saudi Arabia, because in 2016 I ran a training course for officials, Nepali officials, and there was a draft agreement. Saudi Arabia has been signing agreements, dedicated domestic worker agreements with many countries, including with East Asia, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya. That's where I have been doing some work recently about bilateral agreement. So I want to know what was the reason for this. Final point, I mean, there was a discussion mentioned about these bans. Of course, these bans are common for many countries. Indonesia is one of the major countries which imposes bans. They had a moratorium for migration to many countries, and also to Malaysia several times. Malaysia also has a domestic worker agreement with Indonesia, which has expired since 2016. They are still negotiating to get an agreement going. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for your observation. Sorry. Yeah, it's there. Yeah, thank you so much for your observation. I mean, the way domestic work is debated in internal policy circles of Nepal is is very, very different than, other other sectors that people debate. And it's quite clearly, I mean, there are so many documents from the ILO and other organizations. It's quite clearly mentioned that there needs to be a separate documents for domestic work. If we really want to, and the message is quite clear from this state of Nepal, that if you really want to get into if you really want our domestic workers, then you have to get into a separate document. You have to have a separate contract with us. I mean, and the thing that you are saying that there is no separate contract for domestic work and separate employment agreements, but there was separate employment agreement, which I completely agree with. Now this is where things get extremely complicated, because there are so many different names of this particular document. Bilateral agreement, MOUs, general agreements, contract, and I think I've mentioned in my paper, there are 5, 6, 7 names that people use. So maybe there is some sort of some sort of language issues is happening over here, I believe, because clearly Nepal says that there is a separate BLA with Jordan, and that's why they are allowing citizens to go to Jordan for domestic work. Now, when you are talking about Saudi Arabia, this is actually it's not only with Saudi Arabia. Nepal is in talks with so many countries for domestic work, because it really wants to make sure that irregularity is basically curbed. So what is happening is, majority of the employers, especially from Middle Eastern countries, they issue paper-based visa, right, to the potential migrant domestic workers of Nepal. So these visas arrive in Sri Lanka or maybe in India, and majority of the people, they migrate to India and Sri Lanka, without any documents and everything. Now because majority of the women can go to India because the borders are open and all, and then they change the document and they go to Middle East as a regular migrant worker. This is something that.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you should start wrapping up, because we have 2 more questions in 2 minutes.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Thank you for your observation. Maybe I can talk about it later.
Thank you. So maybe let's take these 2 comments together, Yuval and then Adam.
Hi, thank you, Ayushman. I was wondering if you have any knowledge as to what's happening in the Nepalese embassies in these receiving countries, because you're talking about exclusion and entrapment of the unworthy migrants. And I'm wondering if it's happening also by the embassies. I think generally, what's happening between the embassies and their nationals abroad is under research. So I'm interested about that. And also, sorry for being so lawyery, but there are some legal obligations as that the local consulate has vis-a-vis its nationals. So, for example, if this women who came illegally because it came not under a BLA to a foreign country will receive a new passport in lieu of the one that was confiscated, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if you have any knowledge on that.
Thank you, Yuval. Adam?
Yeah, thank you. I found the description of the Nepalese experience really interesting, and many of the key features are really similar to the Philippines experience, which is the one case I know, where first, that the main focus on policy is concerns around domestic workers and exploitation of women. 2, the willingness in a few cases to ban workers going to specific countries. And then 3, the new insistence on BLAs before resuming the deployment of workers are all, sort of parallel experiences. The part that's tricky, and I wonder if your work has gone into this at all, is when after the country decides we'll demand a BLA going forward, whether or not they're able or willing to demand the kinds of provisions that could really protect domestic workers. And in part because, for instance, if Nepal demands clauses that have extremely strong protections, it'll just, reduce the competitiveness of Nepalese workers in the employment market relative to Bangladeshi workers or Indian workers or some other group. So the question is, once you get to this stage in the process of demanding BLAs going forward, are the countries is Nepal really demanding deep commitments or more of solving a public relations issue through the demanding of BLA?
Thank
Yes.
you. Ayushman, you have just 1 minute to respond, okay?
Okay.
Because we need to move
Okay,
on.
so I'll start with Adam's question. So I think yes and no at the same time, because Nepalese government is using it as a very, very political, thing in the source countries. But at the same time, they are able to like negotiate quite a lot of clauses, with the source country, because I mean, in Jordan, majority of the like women, they do not pay anything, like employers take care of literally everything. So clearly Nepal is pushing its own agenda through it, because I mean, Nepalese domestic workers are demanded in the whole world. And quickly to answer Yuval's question, I think what's happening in the embassy, I mean, clearly when people like, face exploitation a lot, they leave domestic work. The majority of the participants that, I mean, like, so many participants in the place where I did my research, they leave the particular place, and the first place that they go is the embassy. Now, what happens is they meet somebody, like outside the embassy, like guards and all, and they're like, why do you want to get deported? I'll actually help you find something, some jobs and all. Like, so, but there were some women, they're like, no, we really want to go back. I mean, my experience is horrible, blah, blah, blah. So they go back. But then, the guards and all those, the barrier which is before the embassy, that sometimes they buy into that and they stay in, the hosting country for really, really long time. So embassy does, the first point of contact is embassy. Second point of contact is the guard. And third point of contact is the recruitment agency. They also facilitate irregularity in many hosting countries. And second, about legal obligations, I'm really not, I'm not sure whether I understood it. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Ayushman, and thank you, Rebecca, for your response. This was a really interesting panel, and we'll just move directly to the